When we talk about religion and abortion, the conversation usually gets pretty black and white fast. But today, we're diving into an ethical framework that is all about the nuance. We're going to look at the Baha'i Faith's really personal, really principled approach to one of the hardest decisions a person can face.
So let's just start with this question right here. What would it even look like if a faith didn't just give you a simple yes or no, but instead gave you a kind of moral toolkit to figure it out for yourself? This idea is absolutely central to the whole Baha'i perspective on this.
All right, so here's our roadmap. We're going to look at why there isn't a specific law, then touch on the core belief about life and the soul. After that, we'll get into the tough exceptions, the actual process for making a decision, and finally, what this all tells us about the bigger goal of becoming morally mature.
Okay, so the starting point for all of this is, well, it's actually pretty surprising. It all begins with what isn't there, what's not written down in the sacred texts. And that points us to a really unique institution called the Universal House of Justice.
That's right. You heard me. The foundational texts of the Baha'i Faith just don't have a specific line-by-line law about abortion. Right off the bat, that tells you we are dealing with a completely different kind of religious guidance here.
So, if there's no specific law, then what? Is it just a free-for-all? Not exactly. The teachings actually set up a living, breathing institution to provide guidance for the future. That's the Universal House of Justice, the international governing body for Baha'is. They have the authority to legislate on things that aren't spelled out in the texts. But, as we're about to see, their approach has been incredibly thoughtful and deliberate. So, even though there's no detailed law on the books, that doesn't mean there's a vacuum. Far from it. There's a core spiritual principle that acts as the foundation for this whole framework. This is really where the moral guidance begins. And here it is. This is the bedrock. The Baha'i teachings are super clear on this point. The human soul, that unique individual spark, is present from the moment of conception. This single belief is what shapes the entire general attitude toward abortion, because from this perspective, you're talking about the termination of a human life. And because of that belief, the general rule is that abortion is to be strongly deprecated. It's seen as a very serious act. But wait, listen to that wording again. Strongly deprecated. It doesn't say absolutely forbidden. It doesn't say banned in all cases. And that distinction, that little bit of breathing room in the language, that is the key to everything. And that key distinction is what leads us right into the nuance, into what the Baha'i writings themselves call the gray area. This is where it gets really interesting. So even with this very strong principle of protecting life right from the start, the framework isn't rigid, it's not brittle. The guidance makes it explicit that yes, there are some situations, some circumstances where an abortion might actually be justified. It literally builds compassionate flexibility right into its own moral code. So where are the lines? Well, on some things, they're pretty clear. Using abortion just because the child is unwanted or as a form of birth control, that's a definite no. But then you look at the other side, the heartbreaking stuff. We're talking serious medical reasons, the tragedy of rape, or a diagnosis of a severe disability. In those cases, the guidance says, okay, here it's potentially justifiable. Now this is absolutely crucial. Even in those justifiable cases, the decision is never prescribed. No one is ever told they should have an abortion. It is left 100% to the people involved. In fact, Baha'i institutions are specifically told to back off, to bring no pressure, because the choice belongs to the person who has to live with it. All right, so if the final call is left to the individual, how in the world are they supposed to make such a profound choice? Well, the framework doesn't just leave them hanging. It actually provides a clear process, a path to follow. This quote right here is basically the whole instruction manual. It says the entire decision is left to the conscience, but it's not a decision you make in a vacuum. You have to carefully weigh competent medical advice, and you have to consider it all within the context of the spiritual teachings we've talked about. It's like a three-legged stool: science, spirit, and your own personal conscience. So let's just break it down. Step 1, you get the best medical advice you can. Step 2, you reflect and pray on the spiritual guidance. And step 3, you make the decision that you, in your own heart and mind, can live with. It's not about finding a loophole. It's about engaging in a really mature, responsible process. So let's zoom out. What does all of this add up to? What's the ultimate goal of a system that puts so much emphasis on a personal process and individual conscience? The big takeaway is this. The Baha'i approach isn't a checklist of do's and don'ts. It's an ethical framework.
And its genius is that it holds two powerful ideas at the same time: a really high moral standard for the sanctity of life, balanced with a deep, compassionate flexibility for the messy, painful realities of being human. And this quote right here, this really gets to the why. This whole approach is tied into a core Baha'i belief that humanity is collectively entering an age of maturity. And part of growing up means we have to move beyond just blindly following orders. It means learning to take responsibility for our own moral choices, using principles as our guide instead of just rigid rules.
So in the end, we're left with this really big question to think about. What does it truly mean for a faith to value your moral maturity more than your obedience to a set of rigid rules? It's a perspective that really challenges us to think differently about faith, about personal responsibility, and about how we make the most difficult choices of our lives.